Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this video, we'll be looking at how to configure a routed VPN using OpenVPN on the CM685V4 router. Although this configuration is the same on the CM685VX, CM820 and CM950 routers as well. A routed VPN means that our client and our server have different subnets. So this will look at how to configure routing between the two different subnets so that packets can travel through the VPN. Our first step to allow communication between the client and the server is to create some secure keys. To do this, we need to connect to our router via SSH. So I'm going to open PuTTY and then enter the router's LAN IP address, which is 192.168.1.1, and then make sure that the port number is 22 and the connection type is SSH. Then click Open. Then go ahead and log into your router. Now we're logged in, we're going to enter the command cd for change directory, followed by a space and then /etc/easy-rsa. Then run the command easy-rsa followed by a space and then init-pki, and then type yes to confirm. This will clear and create a new public key infrastructure on your router. Next, we're going to create the certificate authority by running the command easy-rsa build-ca. Then we'll be asked to enter and verify a PEM passphrase. This can be anything you like, just make sure you remember it because we'll need it for later steps. And then we can give our certificate authority a name. Again, this can be anything. Once that's done, run the command easy-rsa gen-dh and click enter. So this process is generating two 2048-bit prime numbers that will be used to create the public and private keys later on. This step can take several hours to complete, so we'll come back to it once it's done. Okay, so now that that's finished, we're going to enter the command easy-rsa gen-req server no pass. So this is generating the private key for your server. Once it's finished, you'll be asked to give it a name. I'm just going to call it server to make it clear, but you can make this anything that you'd like. Once that's done, we can create our server certificate. We do this by entering easy-rsa sign server and then server. This last server is the common name that we just entered, so make sure that they match. And then type yes to confirm. And then we'll need to enter the passphrase that we created at the start. Next, we're going to create the client key and client certificate. So we'll enter the command easy-rsa gen-req client no pass. Similarly to the server, you'll be asked to give this a common name. Again, I'm just going to call this client to make it clear. And for the certificate, enter easy-rsa sign client and client. Type yes to confirm and then enter in that same passphrase. So now we've generated all of the files that we need and we need to get them from the router to our PC. To do this, open up an FTP client. I'm going to be using WinSCP and then log in using the same LAN IP address and keeping the port number as 22 and using the same username and password as you used to log in via SSH. Okay, so now I've logged in. On the left-hand side here, I've got a folder on my PC called OpenVPN. This is where I'm going to store the files. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the router. To find the files that we need, you'll need to go up one folder and then open the folder called etc and then easy-rsa and then pki. From this folder, I need this ca.crt file. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this across. We also need this dh.pem file as well. Some of your files might be called a little bit different, but from this folder you need that .crt file and the .pem file. Next, open the private folder, and from here we need these files called client.key and server.key. Then go back and into issued, and we need both of these CRT files here. Alright, so now we've got the 6 files that we need to do the basic OpenVPN configuration. Before we configure OpenVPN, there's a couple of other settings that we need to change first. So on the server, we need to change the LAN IP address as well as set up a public IP. So we'll start by changing the LAN IP address. To do this, go to Network and then LAN and then enter the new IPv4 address here. So I'm going to make it 192.168.8.1, and then when you're done, click Save and Apply. Now it might take a couple of minutes for the router to save and to reboot as well, and you'll need to reconnect to the new LAN IP address in your browser. So now my router has reconnected. Now let's look at how to set up a public WAN IP. First thing you need to do is change the APN by going to Network and then Mobile. This will be a little bit different depending on which carrier that you're with, but for Telstra, the new APN that you need is telstra.extranet. Once you've changed the APN there, click Save and Apply. Now because Telstra gives you a dynamic public IP address, I'm also going to set up dynamic DNS. To do this, go up to Services, and then to DDNS, and then click Edit on this IPv4 example. Now I've already filled this out with some of my details, but you'll need to make sure that you check Enabled, choose the DDNS service provider, enter the host name that you've set up with them, and then your username and password with that provider. And once you've filled all of that out, scroll down and click Save and Apply. Once it's saved, make sure you hit Start. Lastly, to make sure that we can actually use the host name, we'll need to change some of the firewall settings. To do this, go to Network and then Firewall and go across to the Security tab. And then here where it says Ping from WAN to LAN, change this to Allow, and then under HTTP access, allow the access from WAN as well. And when you're done, click Save and Apply. Okay, so now we're ready to configure OpenVPN on our server. So go back to Services, and then VPN, and then go to OpenVPN. Now here you can either create a new instance. If you do this, make sure that you choose one of the server options from the drop-down menu. I'm just going to edit this sample server here. Click on Switch to Advanced Configuration, and make sure you check Enabled. There's a few other options that you can configure here as well, and you can also add additional fields if you want to. I'm going to leave everything else as the default though, and then click Save and Apply. Next we'll go across to cryptography, and this is where we're going to upload those key files that we saved. To do this, go to Additional Field, choose CA, and then click Add, and then choose File, and then upload the ca.crt file. Now we need to do the same for DH, where we'll upload the dh.pem file. We'll also add the server certificate, and then lastly the server key file. Once you're done with that, click Save and Apply. Okay, so that's the very basic configuration for OpenVPN on the server. Now let's take a look at the client side. Okay, so now I'm connected to my client router. I also need to change the LAN IP address for this one. So go to Network, LAN, and then enter the new IP address, which in this case I'm going to make it 192.168.10.1. Again, this might take a few minutes for the router to reconnect, and when it does, you'll need to enter the new IP address in the browser. Okay, so now my LAN IP address has changed. I'm going to go to Services, VPN, and then OpenVPN. This time we're going to edit the sample client instance. Now from here, make sure that you tick Enabled and that client is selected as well, and then click Save. Next, go to Advanced Configuration and then Cryptography, and we need to upload some of those files again. So go to Additional Field and then add CA and upload the ca.crt file. And then we need to add cert, and this is where you upload the client.crt file. And then lastly, we'll add the key, which is the client.key file. And then when you're done, click Save. Next, I'm going to go to VPN, and here, make sure that client is ticked, and then where it says remote, enter that host name or the public IP address of your server, followed by the same port number, so 1194, and then click Save and Apply. Now once you're done, go back to the overview page, and make sure you press Start next to your client instance, unless it's already running like mine is. Okay, so the OpenVPN tunnel should now be established. We can double check this by going to Network and then Interfaces. And you can see the OpenVPN client here. Next, let's configure the routing for our VPN. So to do this, you'll need to go back to your server's settings. So from here, go back to Services and then to VPN and then OpenVPN. And then click Edit on your server instance and go to Advanced Configuration. From here, go to Networking and then scroll down and add a new route field. And in this field, enter the IP address of the subnet for your client. So in my case, it's 192.168.10.0, followed by the subnet mask. Then scroll down and click Save. Next, go across to VPN and we'll add a new push field. Under here, choose Custom and then type the word route, followed by your server subnet, in my case is 192.168.8.0, and then followed by the subnet mask. Now you might also need to add this client config directory, mine's already here, and then in this field you'll want to enter this pathway, which is /etc/openvpn/ccd. Then make sure you tick this ccd exclusive, and then click Save and Apply. Next, you want to reconnect to the router via SSH, this time using the new LAN IP address. And then type the command mkdir, followed by /etc/openvpn/ccd. Now mine says it can't create the directory because the file already exists, which is fine. And then type the word echo, followed by in quotation marks, iRoute, and then the client subnet and the mask. And then outside of the quotation marks, put a little right angle bracket followed by the path, which is etc/openvpn/ccd/client. And then back on the web interface, go to the OpenVPN overview and press stop on the server and then start again. Okay, so now our OpenVPN is configured and we're ready to test it. So here I've got my PC connected to my client router, and then I have another device connected to the server. To test the OpenVPN tunnel, I'm going to ping the server as well as the device behind the server from this PC. So to do this, I'm going to open up a command window, and then I'm going to type ping 192.168.8.1 to ping the gateway of my server. If this is successful, you should see 4 successful pings from this PC to the server. Next, I'm going to type ping 192.168.8.145, which is the IP address of my device behind the server. And again, we can see that we've got 4 packets successfully sent from this PC to the other device, meaning that our OpenVPN is established and working correctly. Okay, so that is all for this video on how to configure the basics of OpenVPN on the CM685V4 router. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next video.